Stephen Brown, an economist at Capital Economics, encapsulates the Fed's unenviable position with chilling precision. It is getting harder to envisage Fed Chair nominee Kevin Walsh persuading the rest of the Fed to support further interest rate cuts until there is firmer evidence that inflation is on a path back to 2%. Harder to envisage. The very nominee chosen explicitly to cut rates is now finding it increasingly difficult to deliver on that promise because oil is at $91 a barrel, because the Strait is closed, because the war is now on its 8th day, and because the Sheba oil field was attacked by 16 drones this very morning. Every drone intercepted costs a Saudi missile and compels another cargo ship to anchor outside the Strait. Every ship that waits means more days of a closed Hormuz. Every day of a closed Hormuz means further increases in oil prices. Every dollar of oil price surge means more inflation. And every 1/10 of a percentage point of inflation above 2% means one fewer vote for Walsh's proposed rate cut. The missiles are flying in the Gulf. Simultaneously, the economic consequences are hurtling towards every American family's finances, with the same speed and inevitability, yet with far less interception capability. There is no THAAD system for stagflation. There is no interceptor missile for a Federal Reserve that is utterly paralyzed and cannot move. There is no defense budget line item allocated for the inflation that will inevitably arrive if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed through April, through May, through the 4 to 6 weeks that keep stretching indefinitely into the horizon. Every time Trump posts on Truth Social about unconditional surrender, while missiles are being intercepted over Sheba today, the economic shrapnel has already penetrated the perimeter. Share this video with every contact you have right now. The U.S. economy lost 92,000 jobs last month. This extra time directly translates into increased costs, which companies then pass on to importers, who then pass them to retailers, and finally, to consumers. Consumers who are already justifiably angry about prices, having been so for the past 5 years. Nomura's economists assert that the Iran conflict solidifies the case for many central banks to hold rates steady. Capital Economics has warned that inflation would rise by 0.5 percentage point in most Asian economies if Brent crude remains at current levels. Former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen observed that the situation puts the Fed even more on hold, more reluctant to cut rates than they were before this happened. In the very same week, Trump informed reporters that the Iranian military had been largely destroyed. His Treasury Secretary announced the largest bombing campaign yet, specifically targeting Iranian missile launchers. His defense manufacturers were summoned to the White House to discuss quadrupling weapons production. Every signal emanating from this administration points towards more war, a longer war, a bigger war. More war inevitably means further oil disruption. More oil disruption means higher prices. Higher prices, in turn, mean the Federal Reserve simply cannot cut interest rates. The inability to cut rates means mortgage rates remain high, car loans stay expensive, and business borrowing remains costly. The jobs number, already a negative 92,000, will only worsen. The entire affordability message upon which Trump has built his presidency will be utterly swallowed by this war, whose full economic consequences were clearly not modeled before the first bomb fell on February 28th. Every week this conflict continues. Every dollar oil rises. Every 1/10 of a percentage point inflation climbs. Those votes become increasingly difficult to secure. Bloomberg Economics succinctly states that higher energy prices would push Europe to recession. For the U.S., it places the Federal Reserve in an impossible position. Stuck between a war that is driving inflation higher and a president demanding lower interest rates. An impossible position, they stress. Not merely difficult, not just challenging, but truly impossible. This is Bloomberg Economics' clinical assessment of the Fed's predicament on the 8th day of this war. Let us now translate what this impossible position truly signifies for the average American family. Geopolitical abstractions invariably manifest as tangible kitchen table realities, often arriving without warning. Nationally, gas stands at $3.32 a gallon. Oil analysts are actively calculating the ramifications should Iran intensify its actions. Every $10 increase in the price of oil adds 0.2 percentage points to inflation. Oil has already surged by over $20 in just 8 days. That stark mathematical reality is already priced into the goods that will begin appearing on store shelves in the next 60 to 90 days. Fresh produce, packaged foods, clothing, electronics, essentially everything that has transited through the Strait of Hormuz or the Red Sea. Rice exports currently stranded at Indian ports will inevitably translate into increased food prices across South Asia and Southeast Asia, with ripple effects through agricultural commodity chains even reaching American grocery stores. The sharp spike in fertilizer prices will feed directly into next season's crop prices. Shipping routes are now being diverted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 2 to 3 weeks to every Asia-Europe voyage. Trump, for his part, has made no secret of his reasons for picking Warsh. He desires cheaper borrowing, lower mortgage rates, a stimulated economy, and an affordability story that he can champion in the upcoming midterms. However, Warsh's specific philosophy on inflation possesses a characteristic that is now critically important and, perhaps, problematic. He places relatively little emphasis on oil prices when assessing inflation. His established framework tends to treat energy price spikes as temporary pass-through events that do not necessarily warrant a monetary policy response, as he believes they will eventually dissipate. In normal times, during a typical oil spike caused by a contained geopolitical flare-up that resolves with a ceasefire in a couple of weeks, such a framework might be defensible. But this is emphatically not a normal oil spike. This is the Strait of Hormuz being closed. Brent crude is up an astonishing 24% in 8 days. Goldman Sachs is forecasting inflation could hit 3%. The producer price pipeline is already running at 3. South Korea's Kospi index suffered its largest single-day crash since 2008, plummeting by 12%. The Thai Stock Exchange was compelled to impose trading curbs after an 8% decline. If Warsh were to cut rates into an economy with oil at $91 a barrel and inflation nearing 3%, he would undoubtedly be fueling a burgeoning inferno. The apprehension is palpable among current Fed officials. Minneapolis Fed President Neil Kashkari admitted, "I had a lot of confidence up until a couple of days ago. Now he needs more data." New York Fed President John Williams has publicly stated he wants to see how persistent this is. These are the very Fed officials Warsh needs to convince. They are closely monitoring oil prices and openly expressing their uncertainty. Warsh needs a majority of the 12-person committee to vote for rate cuts. He may have Trump's unwavering support, but he currently lacks their critical votes. Mortgage rates would remain prohibitively expensive, car loans costly, and the housing market, already stifled by years of high rates, would remain frozen. The very economy that Trump has pledged to fix would become further fractured. And politically, the Fed would own that outcome just as squarely. This scenario, where inflation rises simultaneously with slowing economic growth, has a name: stagflation. Economists universally term it so. The last time America grappled with it in a truly serious manner was the 1970s, a decade etched into memory by gas lines, a staggering 13% inflation, 10% unemployment, and a Federal Reserve that ultimately had to raise interest rates to an unprecedented 20% to finally break the price spiral. Paul Volcker, the then Fed chair, achieved this, but at the cost of the worst recession since the Great Depression. As Joe Bercelis, chief economist at RSM, starkly put it this week, the Fed's reaction function is going to experience a real stress test. The risk of stagflation permeates, and all eyes will continue to be focused on the direction of energy prices. Note that he said it permeates, present tense, right now, today. Now, let us introduce the dimension that transforms this Federal Reserve trap from a mere economic policy challenge into a full-blown political crisis. Currently, awaiting confirmation in the United States Senate, is the man Trump has selected to succeed Jerome Powell as Fed chair when Powell's term concludes in May: Kevin Warsh. And Kevin Warsh faces a significant dilemma. Warsh was chosen by Trump primarily because they share one fundamental belief above all others: interest rates should be lower. In the lead-up to his nomination, Warsh publicly stated his conviction that rates should be below the current federal funds rate of 3.5% to 3%. This makes borrowing cheaper, stimulates spending, encourages hiring, and fuels growth, a well-established playbook. Yet, simultaneously, oil prices are at $91 a barrel and rising. Inflation is already above target, and global shipping routes are severely disrupted. Supply chains, which had only just begun to heal after the COVID-19 pandemic, are fracturing once more. Rice exports are stranded at Indian ports, and fertilizer prices are spiking dramatically. Every product transported by sea is becoming more expensive, as insurers have comprehensively repriced the risk of oceanic transit. Goldman Sachs now projects inflation could reach 3% by year-end if oil prices remain elevated, while the Producer Price Index, a leading indicator, is already at 3. This pipeline reading reflects what businesses are currently paying for inputs, costs that will inevitably translate into consumer prices within 60 to 90 days. If the Fed were to cut rates now to salvage jobs, it would effectively pour gasoline on an already raging inflation fire. The dollar would weaken, import prices would surge, and every barrel of oil, already at $91, would become even more costly in dollar terms. Every foreign-made good purchased by Americans would see its price increase. Inflation would not merely remain above target. It would accelerate dramatically. 5 years after the pandemic graphically demonstrated what it feels like when prices relentlessly spiral upwards, the Federal Reserve would be seen to have chosen inflation over jobs, bearing the full political cost of that decision. Conversely, if the Fed chooses to hold rates steady, or even raise them to combat inflation, it would abandon its employment mandate. The 92,000 individuals who lost their jobs would receive no immediate relief. Businesses already struggling under tariffs and slowing growth would face even tighter conditions. And amidst this turmoil, a president publicly campaigned for lower interest rates, all while simultaneously orchestrating the most expensive military operation since the Iraq War. These 12 individuals, gathered around their table in the marble edifice on Constitution Avenue, find themselves ensnared. This is a trap from which there appears to be no exit that doesn't demand a catastrophic cost from someone. Herein lies the essence of this perilous trap, and it is imperative to grasp its implications, for this is where the situation transcends mere economic theory and becomes genuinely terrifying. Not in the visceral way that missile footage might horrify, but in the profoundly unsettling manner that threatens the very financial security of your family, a fear far more potent and personal. The Federal Reserve operates under what it refers to as a dual mandate, essentially two core responsibilities: to maintain inflation near 2% and to ensure high employment. Historically, these two objectives have largely aligned. When the economy experiences a slowdown, unemployment tends to rise. In such scenarios, the Fed typically cuts interest rates to stimulate borrowing, thereby encouraging spending growth, bringing jobs back, and keeping inflation subdued. Conversely, when the economy overheats and inflation begins to climb, the Fed raises rates to cool spending, stabilize prices, moderate growth, and generally keep employment levels intact. This system was meticulously designed for a world where inflation and unemployment typically moved in opposing directions. Iran's recent actions, however, have simultaneously pushed them in the same, dangerous direction. The economy's loss of 92,000 jobs last month serves as a stark warning sign of a potential recession. In any normal economic climate, the Federal Reserve's standard response to such job losses would be to cut interest rates. In Washington, D.C., nestled on Constitution Avenue, stands a building of impressive white marble columns, bearing the inscription Federal Reserve above its grand entrance. Within its walls, a select group of 12 individuals convenes around a table, tasked with making what is arguably the single most pivotal economic decision on Earth. Every 6 weeks, this committee determines the interest rate, a fundamental figure that dictates the cost of borrowing money within the world's largest economy. This rate reverberates through every aspect of financial life, influencing mortgages, car loans, corporate bonds, government treasuries, and even the credit card balances held by countless American families striving to navigate their monthly expenses. On Saturday, March 7th, these 12 influential figures awoke to a confluence of economic data that defied any conventional Federal Reserve model. Brent crude oil had surged to an alarming $91 a barrel, an astonishing 24% increase in just 8 days, with U.S. crude registering its most significant weekly gain on record. Gas prices were climbing to levels not seen since September 2024, with the national average hitting $3.32 per gallon and continuing its relentless ascent. European natural gas prices had nearly doubled in a week. Compounding this, the Strait of Hormuz was closed, a critical choke point. For the first time in history, both the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz were simultaneously inaccessible. This geopolitical shock hit an economy already grappling with challenges. U.S. inflation was already running at 2%, surpassing the Fed's 2% target even before the first missile was launched. The producer price index had risen by 3.6% year-over-year, indicating significant upstream cost pressures. Alarmingly, the U.S. economy had shed 92,000 jobs last month. Oil is at $91, a 24% increase in 8 days, its biggest weekly gain on record since 1983. Inflation is already above target at 2%, with producer prices at 3.6%, a clear pipeline reading for what consumers will pay in 60 days. Stagflation, inflation coupled with recession simultaneously, is now the named risk, not a fringe prediction. Kevin Warsh, Trump's pick for Fed chair, was chosen to cut rates. The war he never modeled is rendering those cuts impossible. Goldman Sachs projects inflation hitting 3% if oil remains elevated. South Korea's stock market crashed 12%. Europe teeters on the brink of recession, and the Strait of Hormuz remains closed. Day 8. The missiles are flying in the Gulf. The economic shrapnel has already breached the